Well, hello there and welcome back to our series of videos on the topic of reproduction in plants. Now in the last few videos we've been looking at sexual reproduction in plants. So we looked at the parts of the flower and then we looked at where the male gametes and the female gametes form and where they are found. And then we looked at this process called pollination, right, where pollen is transferred from anthers to stigma. We talked about self-pollination, cross-pollination, we talked about insect pollination or wind pollination. So the question now is, after pollination, what happens? Does pollination immediately result in fertilization? Or is it something that happens in between? Now that's what this video is going to be all about. So in this video, we'll be talking about what happens after pollination and how does fertilization take place. So in the textbook, you'll find this on that particular page, C30. But first, let's watch a short video that will give us a better understanding of what happens after pollination.
The flower is pollinated, the pollen lands here, but it still isn't fertilization. The nucleus in the pollen still has to reach the nucleus in the egg, down here. Now the pollen grows a long tube like a long straw, which funnels the nucleus to the egg. Seen under a microscope, these pollen grains are germinating. Pollen tubes are growing from the pollen grains. The male nucleus from the pollen passes down the tube on its way to the female egg cell, where they will fuse and fertilization will be complete.
Alright, so that video showed us a bit of the big picture of what happens after pollination. I hope you picked up a few of the key new words there. So like the pollen grain, after it lands in the stigma, it will germinate. It will form a pollen tube. So a pollen tube will grow out of the pollen grain, and the male nucleus will move down the pollen tube to reach the female nucleus, which is in the ovule. Let's take a closer look at that in the diagrams on the next few slides. Alright, so in this diagram here, what you're looking at is the female part of a flower. Right, so here's the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule right here in the center. So on the stigma, you can see that some pollen grains have landed on the stigma. And the stigma secretes a sugary fluid that actually causes the pollen grain to start growing, to start germinating. Right, we use the word germinate. So you can see this germination happening here. Something's growing out of the pollen. What grows out of it is called a pollen tube. So a pollen tube grows out from the pollen grain. So you can see that it's kind of extending itself down into the style and then into the ovary. Now notice that inside the pollen tube, you see these two little dots here. These represent the male nucleus, the male gametes. So inside the pollen tube, the male gametes will then move down the pollen tube, and eventually they will reach the ovule. Let's take a closer look. So here's a different diagram that shows the same thing. Right, you can see that this is the pollen grain here, and the pollen tube is already growing out of it. Inside the pollen tube, we can see that there are the male gametes that are moving towards the female gamete, which is the ovum or the egg. Right, the ovum or the egg is found inside the ovule. Right, and these are the other parts of the flower. So what happens? So firstly, the pollen tube grows down the style into the ovary. Over here, the pollen tube has grown down the style into the ovary. And what happens is that inside the pollen tube, some enzymes will be produced and secreted. And these enzymes are able to digest away the stigma and the style tissue. So that's why it's able to kind of bury its way down towards the ovary. And next, the pollen tube enters the ovule. Right, so you can see it's entering the ovule through an opening, which is called the micropyle. Right, this is a new word to learn, a micropyle, like a micro, very small hole. Right, the pollen tube is going to enter the micropyle. And then eventually when it enters into the micropyle into the ovule, right? Inside the ovule, the pollen tube will absorb some sap and then it will burst. So this will actually burst open, burst, and the two male gametes are then released into the ovule. And then the nucleus of one of these male gametes will fuse with the nucleus of the ovum, which is over here, to form a zygote. So this is fertilization. Right, so the end result is that one of these male gametes will fuse with this nucleus of the ovum, of the egg, to form a zygote. And that is fertilization. Okay, so just some extra information, right, for you. You might have been wondering, right, in this diagram here, why is it that there are two male gametes? Why so strange? Let's take a closer look at the pollen grain to find out. So remember that the pollen grain had two nuclei, right? There was a pollen tube nucleus and a generative nucleus, which I called the male gamete, right? The one that will actually fuse with the nucleus of the egg. Now what happens is that the pollen tube nucleus is the one that is kind of self-sacrificial. Right? The pollen tube nucleus is going to be the one that directs the growth of the pollen tube. So it's the one leading the way and in a sense causing the pollen tube to grow. It eventually degenerates. So this pollen tube nucleus, once it's done its job, once it's produced the pollen tube, it's going to disappear. Now the other nucleus, the generative nucleus, the male gamete, is the one that will eventually fuse with the egg cell. So this generative nucleus, interestingly, it will move down the pollen tube, but as it moves down, it actually divides into two. Right? So that's why there are actually two male gametes inside the pollen tube. Alright, so the generative nucleus will move into the pollen tube and it will later divide by mitosis to form two male gametes. Alright, but what's the point of having two male gametes? Well, that's because I haven't given you the full picture. So again, this is a bit of extra stuff. In plants, there are actually two fertilizations that occur. So there's a process called double fertilization. So remember, we saw that there are actually two male gametes, right? So the generative nucleus in the pollen will divide into two to form two male gametes. And both of these will be released into the ovule. Okay, one of the male gametes will fuse with the ovum, right? And this will actually form the zygote, which will develop into the embryo, right? So the young plant. So this is the one that's going to become the new plant. Now the other male gamete will actually fuse with a different nucleus called the definitive nucleus. So this definitive nucleus is also found in the ovule. So the ovule has several nuclei as well. So while the other male gamete is going to fuse with the definitive nucleus to form what is called the endosperm. Now the endosperm is the part of the seed, right, that will provide nutrients for the embryo. So if you remember, if you've ever planted green beans before, you'll know that it has kind of two seed leaves, right? And then the embryo, it kind of grows out from in between the seed leaves, right? So the seed leaves, they provide nutrients for the embryo, and these seed leaves actually come from the endosperm. Right? So there's actually two fertilizations taking place, and so we call it double fertilization. Right? The first male gamete will fertilize the ovum, and the second male gamete will actually fuse with this definitive nucleus. Okay, but this is totally extra. You don't need to know it. Just interesting facts for you to be aware of, right? Alright, so the other important part to highlight, emphasize again, is that after fertilization, right, the ovary develops into a fruit, and the ovule develops into a seed. Alright, so over here, this is the tomato flower and a tomato fruit. Now, very interestingly, normally on a tomato fruit, or most fruits, you will see two ends, right? There's going to be one end where there's like kind of the stalk of the fruit, and the other end which is kind of like the butt of the fruit. Interesting, very, very interesting. This stalk of the fruit is actually the remains of the flower stalk. You can see it, right? And these little leaves of the tomato, right, which you normally see as leaves of tomato, they're actually the remains of the sepals. Interesting. Now you can see that the entire ovary has kind of enlarged, right? and to form the fruit. And of course, here are the seeds, which were originally the ovules. And at the bottom here, interestingly, you actually see that the bud of the fruit, I call it the bud of the fruit, is actually the remains of the stigma and the style, right? Where it's used to be where the stigma was, where the pollen was transferred to, but it's now been reduced to this little tiny hair-like thing. So next time you look at fruits in the grocery store, try to ask yourself, hey, what used to be the stalk of the flower? What used to be the stigma of the flower? It's quite an interesting thing when you look at different fruits in the supermarket in that way. Alright, we've reached the end of the chapter on plant reproduction. Hooray! So now what's left to do is just make sure that you've understood everything. So firstly, from this video, understanding what happens after pollination. Right? Make sure you're aware of the events, so like the growth of the pollen tube or how the male gamete moves down the pollen tube. And make sure that you have some idea how to describe how fertilization takes place. And also to be aware that after fertilization, how does the flower then develop into a fruit? Right? Which part becomes which part? Alright, so that's all. I'll see you back in class. Hope you had a good time learning about plant sex.